Thank you so much and welcome everyone to our webinar, Youth Produced Media, Empowering Our Global Creators and Leaders. I'm your host, Stephanie Potts-Stevenson, Project Director for Reinvent the Classroom at Digital Promise. And I'm joined by two co-hosts this evening, Kristen Palazzolo and Rebecca Banks, both project managers with Digital Promise. At Digital Promise, our mission is to accelerate innovation in education to improve opportunities for all learners. This means closing the digital learning gap not only in access, but also in participation and in powerful use. Digital Promise invests at the intersection of three stakeholder groups: educators, researchers, and developers, because we know that to realize technology's full potential, we must focus on amplifying human capacity. Educators need every possible tool and resource to engage, motivate, and personalize learning both with and for their students. Developers must be informed by education research and be supported by connections with practitioners to design products that solve salient challenges that improve student outcomes. And researchers must evolve new methodologies that produce results in a way that matches the speed of technology. To accomplish these goals, we believe in the power of networks, the sharing of stories from the field, support and investment in research, and an engagement in lifelong learning. Our networks bring together education stakeholders in critical conversations about pedagogy and educational equity. One of those networks is our Reinvent the Classroom program. In collaboration with HP, Microsoft, and Intel, Digital Promise brings together educators from across the US and Canada in our HP Learning Studios, HP Spotlight Schools, and our HP Teaching Fellows. The schools and educators in this network exemplify Digital Promise's principles of powerful learning. These principles are built upon decades of learning sciences research, and they guide educators to design learning experiences that engage the hearts and minds of learners. These learning experiences provide opportunities for students to deeply engage in their learning while using technology in ways that contributes to closing the digital learning gap. Powerful learning means that learning is personal and accessible, authentic and challenging, collaborative and connected, and inquisitive and reflective. These sets of principles do not work in isolation, but they're synergistic and are mutually supportive. So this evening, we have two wonderful facilitators, Lisa Jobson, who's a Learning Experience Design Project Director and 360 Story Lab at Digital Promise, and Carissa Belwin, the Learning Experience Design Project Manager for Sienna Solutions at Digital Promise. So now I will turn it over to them for introductions and introduction to our panel.
Great. All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Stephanie. Nice to see hear everyone. So I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about youth-produced media. The National Association for Media Literacy Education here in the United States defines media literacy as the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all forms of communication. And at Digital Promise, just like Stephanie just mentioned, we believe that stories inspire ideas and incent action. And we know that when students engage in media, they not only consume, but they have the power to create and share their own stories across their local communities and even throughout the world through different modes of technology like social media, television news outlets, photography, documentaries, and podcasts. And so now it's time to introduce our HP Teaching Fellows who are panelists tonight. So we can start with Laura and work our way to the right.
Hi, I'm Laura Davies. I'm in Wrangell. I teach middle school science, math, technology, and art. And I'm sitting in a really stormy weather on my phone, but I'm very happy to be there.
Hey everyone, my name is Rob Canone. I am an elementary program consultant for the York Catholic District School Board, located in Aurora, Ontario, Canada. I'm so pleased to be with you all tonight for this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Hello, my name is David Hall. I'm a teacher, librarian, and special education resource teacher in Toronto, Canada, and also grateful to be here.
Hi, I'm Seth Brady. I'm a social studies teacher from Naperville Central High School in Naperville, Illinois. I also do some work as project director of our state's Global Education Certificate, and thank you as well for the invitation to be here.
Good evening, I'm Christian Scott. I'm a middle school social studies teacher in Boston Public Schools, and I'm also the school's technology coordinator. I'm looking forward to sharing with you and learning from my co-panelists. Thank you.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and get started in learning a little bit more about our panelists. So what inspired you to get started in youth media? Why do you do this work? And what about your background led you here?
Hi, I got involved with youth media because I live on an island in Alaska. We have a really unique and special culture, local culture, and I really wanted the students to have a chance to share their culture with other communities and other students. So when we collaborated virtually with other classes, I wanted them to be able to send some videos. And so this project you're looking at is a celebration of a Tlingit person, that Elizabeth Pradovich, who was really important. And the students did an artwork project of her life, a timeline, and then they each made a video about her life. And there was a little QR code attached to the artwork, and it hung up in the museum. And so people could go into our local museum and watch a video about Elizabeth. But also I could share those videos with other students in other communities.
Hey everyone. So prior to becoming an educator, I was a television reporter and producer in my community. And in that role, I recognized the value in creating compelling stories to inform, inspire, and most importantly, the goal is to provoke action. So I've applied this same philosophy in my own work as an educator in supporting students as media makers. And I think we all know and can appreciate that youth are surrounded, including ourselves, by so many forms of media. We live in a media saturated world. So what inspired me to get started was with youth media, is listening to my students whose interests were media, whose questions stemmed from media that they use day in and day out. So, and I also came to learn that when our students make media, they come to understand the nuances of the medium, the power of ideas to inform and shape thoughts, and the necessity to be critical, which hopefully I'll touch upon later. And this visual that you see there is a video of my students sharing what they had done throughout the year in my grade 6 classroom, and they were most proud of being able to connect with others. That was another thing that they enjoyed about the media they created. It wasn't just for them, it was for them to share and for them to have a real world audience provide their perspective as well.
For myself, I think the big thing when I started out prior to being a teacher was being a photographer. And I wasn't really engaged as a child in terms of just the traditional sort of learning methods. And I think when I got to high school and the teacher gave me the first DSLR I ever had, it just became this powerful tool and this like catalyst to actually engage in different things that I normally wouldn't do. So anytime I had an opportunity to engage in any kind of learning or project, I'd find an excuse to embed some kind of photography or digital media into it. So I took that learning experience from my childhood through my work experience prior to being an educator, and then being an educator now, to the same thing with the students that I have, and just making sure that they have an opportunity to use the tools and the technology that they have in front of them to really empower their voice. So what you see in front of us here are just an example from this past year, where we're all inside a virtual learning environment because of the pandemic. And a lot of students didn't have the same sort of tools that they traditionally would, but we said, hey, pick any sort of device or technology that you have and let's make it work. And I taught them the fundamentals of photography, and we connected them with different people in terms of our board. So my class was a grade 3, we had a grade 6 and a grade 8 class, and we did different sorts of photography pieces as well. So I think it provided them with an opportunity to engage in that medium and also showcase some things that you can do just with simple pieces of technology.
Wow, I really appreciate all of those, the stories of, people's own stories and how that led to media. in some ways, I don't have the same sort of compelling story. It sort of happened in the reverse. So in 2015, I joined with about 50 other teachers in Illinois because we wanted to find opportunities for students to develop as global citizens. And long story short, this resulted in a global education certificate that required a capstone. And that capstone requires research of a global issue. It requires an actionable global issue. It requires students to connect with experts on the ground and then create artifacts that they take into action to affect change. And so when you're thinking about, when students started to think about, and we started to work through it as a teacher students team, you know, how are we going to take action in these different contexts? It just opened the door for all sorts of student produced media in order to achieve those goals. And what was amazing as a teacher, I'm in year 18, and that was probably year 14, is it just made me realize how much, you know, when students are set free, both with questions and with media, they just do absolutely amazing things. So my inspiration, I suppose, comes from students, and it comes from the task, and it comes from, you know, really thinking about how taking action requires works of media that are powerful, professionally done, and really persuasive.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I have to date myself. I was, you know, an 80s kid, Gen X person, grew up with cable TV, MTV, things like that. Or as I explained to my students, my childhood looked kind of like Stranger Things. And I remember in my own middle school social studies classroom, our teacher allowed us to do video projects. So a group of us kind of coalesced around that one rich kid who had the giant video camera that you held on your shoulder. And we would all hang out together, and we were kind of, you know, like our own little Monty Python troupe, just doing really absurd historic skits in the backyard. And then that gratification of like finding creative solutions and how to work with the fact that you had no budget and no tools made you more creative. And it just was so rich and rewarding to share with your classmates, to see the reactions, and to kind of, you know, push the boundaries of what you could do. And when I became a teacher, I was doubly delighted. Not only could I assign projects like that, but the technology had caught up with all those dreams that I had as a 12-year-old of what I wished I could do. So I think that was my second year of teaching that I went online. I think I spent about $35 to get a big green screen set up in my classroom, and it's never come down.
That's awesome. I really enjoyed hearing about how you all got started and where your passions lie, and you can hear a little bit about that in each of your intros and how you kind of share that with your students. And so we'd love to learn a little bit more about, you know, what your students have gained from storytelling. So how have your students used storytelling and design to share their own perspectives and inspire action on issues that they care about? You're welcome to elaborate on any student projects and a few skills that you've noticed your students have gained from those projects.
Hello. So in my project, we that's an example here. Last year, I collaborated with a class in South Korea, and they had made poems using videos and about COVID-19. Nervous that because the students in South Korea were learning English, I was worried about my students judging the English quality engaged. They could not to make their own responses, and immediately almost mimicked the style that the other students made in South Korea. And this student in particular, I thought was really unique because a lot of students engage in trapping as a hobby here in Alaska where I live. And so this student used trapping as a metaphor for COVID, but also wanted to show something he was passionate about that was unique to our local culture. But so they got to talk about our town, but they also saw, oh, sorry, I'm still in school here. They got to share about our culture, but they got to see the similarities of their experience with COVID with people in South Korea. And then this project was when they were in 5th grade. I used to teach 5th grade. And so my student was sharing all the Tlingit words they knew. And we sent this to a school in Taiwan. And the teacher responded back to my student with feedback. And we've referred to this video a lot and several other of the Tlingit language videos. I did not teach them Tlingit language, another teacher did. And that's why I was like, hey, why don't you guys show me what you know? So there was no limit. And this student just rattled off about 30 words that they had learned that year with the hand signs. And so it was really fun to be able to share that with another school and another teacher.
That looks awesome. So seen here are my students who produced a bi-weekly news broadcast, and they just loved it because what they did was they started to determine what the main stories were in their school community. And I like that the question you posed asked, how have your students used storytelling and design? Because really, when you think of it, it's very similar to the design thinking process where you ask a question and then you center your users, or in this context with media, your audience, and then you determine not really a solution, but how best to communicate their story. And it was just so beautiful to see these stories unfold. And as someone mentioned earlier, you know, I became so impressed with how much my students knew and how they were able to edit something so quickly. Understandably, you do need to teach them the nuances of whatever program you're using, but my students, through their interviews with others, they learned how to center other identities and stories. They developed compassion, humility, and an understanding of how best to tell those stories. And they also viewed the stories that were shared with from the teachers and students as a gift. And they needed to determine, again, through which lens am I going to tell this story? So this required active listening skills, not necessarily having to plan out all the questions in advance or interjecting with their story, but again, centering the interview. This required collaboration amongst the news team. And then in another piece I'll get to after, we interrogated news stories. But all in all, media production, my students use storytelling to tell the stories of others, decenter their stories, and really spotlight what was happening in their community, their school community. Oh, and this image shows my students exploring human rights issues using QR codes, which you can connect a QR code to an audio file. You can connect a QR code to a Flipgrid video, and they created a human rights issues museum where students in the community could interact with the stories and learn a bit more about those issues. And most importantly, in that one, a lot of students in our school community didn't know about many human rights issues happening in our own country, Canada. So it was really eye-opening for students in the community to see that and interact with it in that way.
So for myself this year, I have the privilege of being a special ed and resource teacher, but also a teacher librarian. So I get to partner with a bunch of students from kindergarten all the grade 8. And one of the big projects that we've worked on this year as a school is really unpacking what our identity looks like, what it sounds like. And that big piece ended up being this I'm from poem, and students sharing from kindergarten to grade 8 what's important to them about their identity. And through sharing those stories and writing out those poems and publishing that book, we now have this podcast that students decided to pick up as a medium. And I think it's important to note that the same thing that Robert was just mentioning, the storytelling and the design is the big piece rather than just the simple tool. So when students took the identity piece as the vehicle for what they were talking about, it really became evident in terms of what we wanted to do with this podcast. So currently with our podcast, we have a number of different segments. That first one is called Speaker's Corner. And that's just students having a discussion about a certain issue or topic for their episode. And then we have a JL Reads where they're talking about something connected to that same issue or topic. So for instance, we have a couple groups talking about identity and racism within schools. We also have a group talking about the environment in terms of how might we as students be agents of change. And then the other piece was on mental health in terms of what that looked like when we were isolated in home, and then now we're back in school and we're stressed out about moving and transitioning into high school. So having discussions about the articles and interviewing different people, those have been big things that students have really enjoyed doing for this podcast. And just in this little bit of short amount of time right now, they're developing this confidence and this curiosity in terms of how they can share their story, but also engage with others in terms of asking about other people and their stories through those interviews that we do as well. And then just rewinding back to last year, I look at the 368 projects that I did with my my class, which is a grade 3 class in virtual school. I realized throughout the time, I said, hey, I'm gonna teach you this tool and I'm gonna teach you how to use this and we're gonna do these great things. But I realized afterwards, when I learned about the students' stories virtually, that we really had to focus on who they are and what their greatest challenge was. And it ultimately ended up being, we were isolated for just about a whole year. We haven't even, some of them were in their apartments and they hadn't even gone out their buildings for months. So we really focused on making a connection with our grade 3 students. We connected with the grade 6 and grade 8 class to really focus on some different kinds of stories that we wanted to focus on. So here we have 368 comics. Each student created a comic in terms of the story that they had for their identity or any kind of story that they wanted to make. But we had the grade 6s and the grade 8s also contribute their photographs, their audio voices, and we embedded all those together. And then throughout the year, we didn't just focus on that piece. We thought about, okay, what are the stories and things we want to do? So we shared identity stories through cookbooks. We shared our research about Black Canadians who we might not have known before through Flipgrid podcasts, right? And we also use photography as a place for us to publish our own photography and share narratives as well. So it became in a realization that it's less about the tool and the technology piece, which is to me an amazing and powerful piece, but it's about what are the students' stories and what they really want to share, and how might that best reflect it, how might they use the technology to help that as a vehicle. So that's been a big piece of what they learned, but also myself as well, in realizing it's not about that tool, it's about what do they want to share and how can we do that together. And that was the fun part about it all.
Yeah, I really love that notion that, you know, it's really process oriented, right? The eventual artifact is almost the end result, or the result of that process. And I certainly appreciate this question as well. One of the things that I like about it is the sense of story in the product and story in the process. And so one of the almost accidental parts of the process I mentioned before that a group of teachers developed is students have to create a narrative that describes the entire behind the scenes process that leads to action. So for example, why they developed the question they developed, which are often very personal. The process of research, the process of connecting with experts, and also the process of thinking through how that research is best expressed in an artifact. So why a particular output is going to affect change. The other layer of the question is the stories that students end up telling through through their digital pieces. The one that you see here, the question that goes along with it is, what is the best way to address mental health and suicide in Japan? And so the student researched this for some time, had an idea of where she wanted to go, that she wanted to create a graphic novel, manga style comic, had it all written, not quite drawn. She drew this herself. She's an incredible artist. And when she spoke with her experts, she had to modify the story because suicide is just too taboo for Japanese society. So this is a story. The girl on the left and right are two, both stand out from the crowd. In a more homogenous society like Japan, that's a big deal. The girl on the right is mixed race Japanese, and the girl on the left, in true manga fashion, has a mutation where roses grow out of her hair. So these girls are sort of independently struggling and find one another and are able to think through their own their own differences and negotiate their own identities. And what's really amazing about this is so often these stories that are on the surface about other people and other places often are about students themselves. So these stories are stories they tell about themselves in certain ways. Some of the other examples, I think maybe on the next slide, I had a student look at what is the best way to prevent a future Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone. That center picture there is the end result. So she ended up creating a choose your own adventure game that was based on 7 factors she researched on Ebola. So some of the factors were cultural, like Sierra Leone, it's common to touch the dead. It's common, traditional healers move around quite a bit, as well as scientific. And so she deployed this game in Sierra Leonean classrooms. It's a choose your own adventure where a Doctors Without Borders doctor experiences an Ebola outbreak and has to make choices. And she was able to demonstrate with a pre and post test that the simple playing of that game changed their perceptions of Ebola. Similarly, the one in the upper left is a student who ended up being published. He was a French horn player, used global models to develop safe symphony practices. And one last really neat outcome, there's a student who looked at media literacy, and his output is not so visual, but he ended up working to essentially pass the first ever mandatory media literacy law in Illinois. So just as I mentioned before, to me, it's just amazing how, when you set students free to address these issues that they care about, they do amazing things. And I think they process a lot of their own stories and are able to tell their own stories in powerful ways that they can't through other media.
Wow, that's some really great stuff. And, I'm really enjoying being able to hear you guys as much as a panelist as a listener. This picture that you're looking at now, this is the backside of my classroom where the library lives in the pull down cupboards. And in this particular segment, my 8th grade civics students are reading out their presidential endorsements. And I decided to focus on the idea of what an endorsement was, because it was really hard in the last couple elections to, kind of get beyond the sort of, gossipy, scandally, mudslinging aspect of politics and really talk about what separates the leading candidates. So I had the students look at how major newspapers and media outlets and, career politicians put together an endorsement and then put them together in groups of 3 or 4 to create their own endorsement. And the process was that they had to explain it along the issues. It couldn't be about, hairstyles or, mean tweets or things like that. It had to be substantive on the issues. And there's a tendency when students are just writing something on a Google Doc for my eyes, that they might not put as much of themselves in it or as much effort in it. But when you actually have to take your own words and rehearse it and read it and work with other people, you process it in a different way and you take more ownership for it, and it has more of you in it and less of a kind of let's get the work done to move on with it. The patriotic paraphernalia in that one was just, they kind of wanted to, I guess, sort of throw a little humor in there and buck up their clout by having flags and globes. Over here with my 6th graders and my 7th graders, I teach World History 1 and 2. And we do a lot of focus on mythology and, folk tales and stories from cultures, because I think those are the things that really stick with you is, learning about a trickster figure from history or something like the Odyssey or the Greek gods or the Egyptian gods, rather than just, the names and the dates and the places. And in the beginning of the year, one of the first civilizations that we work with is the Egyptian and the Nile Valley civilizations. And these are some of the gods you can see here, and those are articulated paper dolls that the students make with little push pins at the joints. And they make basically all the Egyptian pantheons, and then I set them to work finding myths where the different gods interact with each other. And they do stop motion movies where, they might act out the tale of, Horus or something like that. And it's kind of their own world. Once they get the paper dolls assembled, it's up to them how elaborate the sets are going to be, the backdrops, the voices, the plot. And I always can tell this is a successful project because I suddenly have a bunch of kids asking for lunch passes so they can come up and work on it some more. As the year progresses on, we go on to another pantheon of heroes, which is, thanks to Rick Riordan, very popular with the students, which is the Greek myths. And the Odyssey it's like a real whale of a myth, and it's kind of hard to tackle. So we broke it down into segments, and I assigned, segments of the myth to each of my 6th grade homerooms to act out their parts. And we spent a lot of time kind of trying to figure out how to stage it, how to set it up, what props we could use, what costumes kids could bring in from home, how they could sort of bring their characters to life. And then we had to learn a lot about, how to have the camera angles set up and how to work with the limits of our sort of narrow green screen space that we had. We don't have like a sound stage. And just watching them get involved in that and excited about that was really fun. And this is the trailer for the Odyssey. And you can see some of the costumes and special effects and backdrops that the students selected to go with various parts of the Odyssey, whether it's the muses on the rocks, or Odysseus and his men here on the beach, or the storms at sea, or the sirens, or Hermes the messenger there. We had a ton of fun with this, and some of these kids will still come back to me and say, I'm learning, Latin in high school, and I'm still remembering what we did back in 6th grade. So to me, that is really something that is powerful, that it sticks with them, and you can see their joy in learning as they make it.
That's amazing, Christian. I think those kinds of projects, as you said, really do stick with students. I'll jump in here with a question for all of you. We know this kind of work isn't always easy, and there can be obstacles. I'm curious, what would you all say are some of the challenges educators might experience, and kind of the flip side of that, how might you overcome those challenges? And maybe this time let's start with David.
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of challenges when it comes to really embedding tech and media and pieces like that. But I think for myself, what's been like a consistent trend has been just that digital divide and access to technology. Now that comes into 2 plays for me. I think that comes with just having the physical access and infrastructure for that, but also the piece of digital fluency. Are students able to take a piece of technology and use it to empower themselves and amplify their voice, or are teachers and educators able to actually support that as well? So a big thing for myself when it comes to that barrier is really on the infrastructure side, is really just advocating for the administration of the district just to invest in the technology infrastructure. And we can do that through ourselves, just using our voices, but also taking the products that students create and showing them and saying, hey, this is what could be. This is what a bunch of students are craving and could thrive on, and really engage a certain population of students who might not normally engage in certain learning pieces if we don't have that technology. So investing in that piece. But the other piece of it was the digital fluency. And I think it's just really, for myself, a relentless focus on collaborating with each other, on starting where students are and building on the problem solving piece. So for instance, last year when I was in grade 3 in virtual school, this is the first time many of the students had a device in their hands. And they didn't even understand how to right click or just do very, very simple things. But we had other students who did know. So leveraging each other to develop those skill sets, but also problem solving with other people. So our pen pals in grade 6 and grade 8, when we started a flip grade topic that just was tech help. So how do I do this? And showing each other that way and empowering each other and saying, hey, this is how you would do it, or showcase that way. Or if we didn't know how to do something, we would leverage each other's support in trying to problem solve that. Even with the photography piece, some of them weren't able to take photographs. So they would take the actual device, they'd move to a certain place and they'd stage it and they'd say, hey, during our class meeting, can you take a screenshot? Because I can't even do that. So just really finding a collective piece to be able to problem solve was a big piece for us. So just just relentless focus on problem solving and removing that barrier is a big piece for ourselves.
That's great. And that kind of peer support, showing them that they can turn to each other. Seth, how would you approach a question like that?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on something that Christian brought up. When you think about like you're dealing with a large period of history, I think as teachers we have always this tension between time, right? Like how much time do we have to study a certain period or do a certain project? And I think that is a real challenge, right? Because there's strong expectations at various levels to get through X curriculum. And the longer I've taught, the more I really, on one hand, I think Christian's absolutely right. There's certain things that are salient to kids and kids are going to remember. And I think the other part of that coin too is really making the case that, even though you may get through content and it because you're the teacher, I think it's almost it's a fallacy to think that students are getting it, but it's undeniable that they're getting real life skills in project management and working as a team, developing technological skills. These are the things that are useful beyond any particular content. And so I think overcoming that challenge is really about working hard to show off the amazing things students do, and taking those opportunities to make the case for what this does for kids in your class and beyond.
Christian, what would you say to that? How would you approach this?
Yeah, I agree with what Seth was saying about the skills that you pick up in terms of project management. And I think that's a skill and a challenge that we don't give our students often enough, is letting them be the problem solvers, letting them struggle with something and then overcome that obstacle. But a key challenge for me that I'm working with right now, we're actually filming the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I have 3 different 6th grade homerooms that are doing it. So that's a total of 76 different students, and every one of them has a part in the production. So to make it look effortless, there is a lot of pre-planning, storyboarding, scripting, coming up with creative solutions so that you can film the same scene with different actors. Like in the Gilgamesh epic, Gilgamesh always has a beard and a helmet, so it could actually be any of the students playing Gilgamesh if one kid is absent. Having lots of duct tape on hand, And, just being mindful of time. I have 45-minute blocks, and that can be a struggle to get something as complicated as a film project moving. But, having that persistence. And then there's also the challenge of, if 8 students are filming, what are the other 20 doing at that same time? So, but I used to be a banquet chef in my past career, so logistical chaos is kind of where I thrive. And I feel like sometimes when my students get to experience a little bit of that, some of them thrive on it too. But yeah, just always keep planning, always have a clipboard going, always have a storyboard going.
I love that. I'm sure your students watch you make sense of the chaos and thrive on the chaos and get energy from that as well. Robert, what about you? Ever hit any challenges you have to, or roadblocks you have to overcome?
Some of the challenges were very similar to what David had mentioned, and I wanted to pick up on one of his points about leveraging the strengths of students. I think it's wonderful and so important to do that. And I remember a time when a teacher was reluctant to integrate a new tech tool in her classroom, and I sent one of my students, Kayla, to her to show her and her students how to use it. And in doing so, that student felt so empowered. So David, I couldn't agree more with that. In speaking with teachers in my own district about some of the challenges they experience, they're often just not sure where to start. Like, they feel there's so many tools, there's so many ideas. They're like, oh, there's so much out there on social media. And they think that they have to be at that level with their students. And to that, I say, like David said before, focus on less the technology, focus on your students, their interests, their lived experience, and be responsive to that and the media that they want to create. So if they want to create a video and maybe you don't quite have the means, or you're not at that comfort level, then try to ideate with your students. What other ways can we record a video? What tools can we use? Maybe we're going to use Flipgrid to record a shorter video before we move into maybe longer full-length news broadcasts. So I think that's a big challenge, that sometimes teachers think they have to go big and they don't know where to start necessarily because they're daunted by that. But I've realized in my own experience with my students that sometimes the most effective youth media products created are simple. Something as simple as recreating or remixing. Like there was recently with my grade 12 students, we looked at the work of multidisciplinary artist Alexandra Bell. Powerful. YouTube her, Google her. She did this installation called Counter Narratives. And what my students did was they used online design tools to rewrite headlines that they felt were misleading or biased. Very simple. And sometimes you might not even need technology to do that, to bring that to life. But again, you can start with something as simple as that, ideating and prototyping using pencil and paper before you come up with the tools to bring that to life and go a step further. So baby steps is how you can overcome those challenges, and start with your students is the response that I would give.
That's great. Laura, anything you would add to this, challenges you've experienced working with your students?
Yes, I teach middle school, so I feel that is an age where we start to get self-conscious a little bit more compared to when we were doing this in 5th grade. And one thing I've started to really stress is your product professional? Did you strive to be professional rather than striving for perfection? So students often want to have, like, in their eyes, what the perfect product's going to be, and that's really hard to achieve. And so then they don't want to share it, or they want to redo it so many times. And we don't have the time to redo something so many times. And I also would like them to feel confident in sharing it with some sort of audience. And so I've started to make my feedback about professional quality. Like, are you looking at the camera? Are you on topic? Are you saying a joke that has nothing to do with what you're supposed to be doing? And I try to give feedback based on that and give them a chance to fix it. So I had a couple students make a video. They were really proud of it. When they showed me, it was lots of jokes when it was supposed to be a serious science video. And I was like, this is what I don't like. I like your humor, but it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so they immediately redid it, and they didn't seem to have hurt feelings. about it. So I do think feedback's important, but I try to help them make a more professional quality rather than strive to be like, oh, you're not the best public speaker. No teacher would say that, hopefully. But anyway, so that's kind of what my angle's been this year, and it's been working nicely.
That's great. So sort of I guess a follow-up to that, and you all, I think you clearly are problem solvers in your classroom, so you kind of address this and how you face challenges, but for educators just getting started or thinking about incorporating youth media into their classrooms, what advice would you give them to do similar work? And maybe we'll go in the same order. David, any advice you'd give other teachers?
Yeah, I think just to build on what was said before, I think Robert, added to that and just saying a lot of teachers start off feeling really overwhelmed with all the different tools and technology pieces out there. And I'd say one of the big things my mentors ever share with me is just try one thing, and being committed to trying that one thing, but always centering the student in terms of their identity is a big piece. I think just back to a couple of weeks ago and just sharing what we've done with photography and unpacking identity. For students, we really focus on exploring Black girls and hair, and how that is something that we need to unpack in terms of what it means to that child, and also what it looks like in terms of when you interact with different spaces. And I think what I learned from trying one thing is, hey, a lot of students can share their narrative and also use different tools to feel empowered and amplified. And it was just something I didn't know until I made sure we started to learn more about what do you think you feel, or when you see this, or when you do certain things as well. So just try one thing, I think, and you'll get better at it. You'll learn different things from it, and you'll grow as well.
Seth, any takeaways or advice you'd give to other teachers?
Yeah, sure. I think the best piece of advice I could give is to ask for advice, right? Whenever you're trying something new, approach it humbly and go to people that you're impressed with and talk through and tell them what you want to do, and seek their advice, right? I mean, the amazing thing about schools is you've got all of these content area experts in so many different areas. So much advice to give, and I've never seen anyone refuse advice.
Love it. Christian, anything you'd add to that or pick up on?
Yeah, I think it's let your students know that you're new to this and that you're working with it, and that bring them along on that journey. I know it's been brought up in some other parts of the panel tonight, but sometimes the students can teach you amazing things. And when they're empowered to do that as part of the project, it makes it come more alive, and it kind of takes some of the pressure off you to have all the answers. When we do projects, when we embrace new technology, I'm not always the leader on it, even though I'm the teacher and the tech coordinator. And I enjoy that. If I have a student who's better at an application than me in the classroom, I will make that person my temporary co-teacher and say, could you take that side of the room and help them troubleshoot? And that's a great moment. So don't feel like you have to be the expert on anything just to try it. Let your class know, you trust them and that we're on this journey together, and let's see what we can do with this, guys. Make them feel part of the process.
Robert, thoughts on this one?
Yeah, to piggyback on what Christian said, you don't have to feel as though you have to be the expert at all times. And that's where leveraging those within your school and within your extended community can certainly be helpful. I know that in my own practice, community stakeholders have played a valuable role in supporting me with helping students acquire new knowledge, new approaches. We went to a news broadcast station where they learned firsthand from news reporters and producers and camera people. And then you can also connect with them virtually and collaborate in that regard. So creating those experiences doesn't necessarily have to fall on your shoulders. Connect with others outside of your classroom and have your students see how you're making those connections to support your learning.
That's great. And showing students that learning happens beyond the four walls and that there are resources out there. Laura, what advice would you give?
I would give start small and with something like the topic that you're going to make a piece about. It's best to start with something that kids already know a lot about, or they're passionate about, or they're excited to talk about. So like whether it's their favorite book or about themselves or their community, I've often started with that and got them excited to do the project, and then later on moved into something a little more complicated. And the other little piece of advice is I try when possible to make an example. Like an example, if it's the first time I do it, even if it's flawed, and then we can dissect, what's wrong with it. And then as time goes, I often have student examples and have it be something the students are passionate about. And that's my advice.
That's great. Thank you. So we have a Q&A function here. If anyone in the audience wants to jump in, I love listening to you all and learning from you. I have one actually, just in one question, just kind of picking up on, I think, what a number of you have touched on, and clearly as part of your practice. We've talked quite a bit about media creation projects, having students create media, but in listening to you all, I think a big part of the skills that students in your classes are honing is media literacy. So being able to define their own relationship to media content instead of having it define them. And so I'm curious for any of you, and I'll just kind of open it to anyone who wants to jump in on this, if how you approach supporting students to detect bias in media that they consume. And Robert, you gave an example of an assignment where you had students rewrite content to address bias, but I'm curious, do you or anyone want to elaborate on this one?
I can start if that's okay. So to answer your question, what becomes a really good resource for my students to interrogate are the daily news headlines, and from a variety of different sources, which is most important. And I think nowadays, more than ever before, we can come to appreciate the importance of preparing our students to be those critically literate learners, if you will. And the way I approach that with my students is through a critical literacy framework from Katie Vance Luce, a researcher, and Mitzi Lewison. They came up with 4 dimensions of critical literacy. The first one is disrupting the commonplace, so refusing to take information at face value and questioning why things are the way they are. Then we consider multiple viewpoints, whose perspective is present, whose is missing, why might that perspective be missing. With the multidisciplinary artist that I mentioned earlier, she does a great job at exploring how even in the newspaper layout, how that itself communicates meaning. Why are some stories on the margins? Why are some stories centered? And if you put that in the context of news media on television, why do some stories get, that 6 o'clock or 11 o'clock lead? There's a phrase in news, if it bleeds, it leads, which I don't like. But why do we give importance to those stories? And how might that shape our perception of those stories? And then the third part of that process, focusing on the socio-political, reflecting on the power that's present, or the power imbalance that's present in those stories. And then lastly, which is most important, is taking action. How can we change this text? How can we rewrite it? How can we bring justice to it, to allow those voices who have been overlooked to come through? So that's a framework that we use in our practice, and the students love interrogating news stories because they don't see themselves represented, or they see themselves and the cultures to which they belong being misrepresented. So that's one approach that we use to deal with bias in media.
Great. Anyone else want to tackle this one or address it?
I'll just give a quick one here. I think definitely the tools that Robert mentioned, absolutely in the framework makes complete sense. I think, as far as like telling stories that are often not told or maybe mistold, one powerful little tool that I think is just transformative is the idea of connecting your representation of people back to those people somehow in getting feedback. So if you're talking about another place or another person or another ethnicity, getting feedback from their perspective, makes for it results in learning, it results in increased agency, and increases the likelihood of just representation.
Thanks, Seth.
Lisa, we do have a quick question, and that was just a clarification from Tara. She had a question about Robert's, school news report, and that was if that involved the whole class or if it was just the students who were interested in participating in that activity.
That's a good question. It can be either or. So we started off as, at the time I was a special education teacher in the school. So I didn't necessarily have my own students. It was more, they would come and go. So I started with the teacher librarian, a news media club, and I welcomed students from grades 4 to 8 to join the media club. But I've seen teachers do it in their own classrooms. And you can make such meaningful connections to what you're learning about in science or social studies, and create a news broadcast of your own in that context. So I certainly see versatility in both areas.
Great. Well, this has been amazing. Huge thanks to all of you for your wisdom and generosity in sharing your experience and expertise. I think we're all coming away from this with a ton of new ideas and kind of thinking about youth media in the classroom. Just before I turn it back over to Stephanie to close us out, I'll share a quick plug for any of you who might be interested. Chris and I both at the start, as you saw in our bios, we work on a project called Sienna Solution Challenge that's inviting classrooms around the world to submit for an opportunity to be awarded $2,500 to sustain or scale their project work. Deadline's January 10th. And if you're interested, you can learn more about it and reach out to us on siennachallenge.org. So again, huge thanks to you all.
Yes, I echo that. Thanks. This has really been wonderful. I appreciated all of the examples that our panelists shared, and especially how this conversation started to speak to the intersection of youth-produced media and equity and inclusion. Before we go, I'd like to share a few micro-credentials that align with our topic this evening. Micro-credentials provide educators with recognition for the skills that they develop throughout their careers, regardless of where or how they learn them. So you can find micro-credentials at microcredentials.digitalpromise.org to continue your own professional learning. We also invite you to keep this conversation going with us by following us on Twitter at #ReinventTheClassroom. We would love to hear some of your main takeaways. So please post, tag us, and we'll continue the conversation. And lastly, we invite you to register for our next webinar, and Rebecca will drop the link to that registration in the chat for you. Our next webinar is titled Ignite Creativity, Bringing Lessons to Life. And in that webinar, we're going to talk about how personalized learning experiences happen when the lessons are interactive and the student becomes the owner of their learning goals. We'll be speaking with HP Teaching Fellows again on that webinar about their experiences in the classroom. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Charlie Radman of HP for coordinating this webinar for us. Thank you to all of our teaching fellows for serving as panelists, my colleagues at Digital Promise for their support, and of course, to all of our participants this evening who took time out of your very busy schedules to join us and learn with us. Have a great evening.